Okay. So what I would like to do, and to be honest, I'm a bit embarrassed because I feel like I've been repeating myself in many talks, but it's because I really believe that things are not changing. We are, how do you say, stuck in a very old way of thinking, both at the city levels, at the regional levels, at the national levels. So forgive me for those of you who might have gone on YouTube, but I feel that this message that I'm trying to bring around the world, I was just speaking last week in Washington, D.C., with the governments of Colombia, Chile, and Mexico on some of these issues through the Inter-American Development Bank. I do think the war, la guerra, sigue. My next book, by the way, well, there's a book coming out in September on value, on why we need to rethink what economic value is. But the next one, I want to call it The War on the Public, la guerra contra el público. Porque, bueno, eso voy a probar a decirlo en español. Yo creo que la izquierda perdió un momento, porque se pusieron demasiado contra la austeridad, sin darse cuenta que la vera tragedia no era el dinero que nos estaba gastando, pero la falta de capacidades, ¿no? The lack of investment in the competences, in the capabilities of the public sector since the 1980s, much longer than the most recent, if you want, problems that we have had in Europe with austerity, which I think Spain has really had, this wrong diagnosis of what the problem is in Europe, which we can talk about later. But what really has been having is we have been worrying since the 1980s more about government failure than market failure. And this has ended up distorting very much our understanding of the need for building learning organizations, knowledge organizations, explorative capacity, innovation within the public sector. And I really think that this is the moment to change if we're interested in battling some of the biggest grand challenges that people have been talking about. Now, how do you move this forward? Sorry. Okay, great. So these are the challenges, and I think many of you probably, if you are policymakers, go to the European Commission probably a lot, or at least receive all their beautiful paperwork where these three words are everywhere. And I've heard also in your own local community and in Viladecans in particular, you are very much having this conversation about how do we achieve sustainable growth, innovation-led growth, and I hope also inclusive growth. So this to me is a very exciting time to talk about what do we mean by these words. What does it mean to tackle not just the rate of growth, do you say tasa de crecimiento, but the direction, no? This is an admission that we need a particular type of growth. Also because if you think about it, in the 1990s, many countries were growing, but they were growing in a problematic way, which actually led to the financial crisis. No? So this is a great time to be really shifting the discussion towards this issue of directionality. And I do believe actually that when we think about innovation at the center of this process, this is a great opportunity to put innovation in the context of this bigger ambition, not for gadgets, not for iPhone 6 to the iPhone 7, but for really tackling what kind of society do we want to live in and how to use investments, innovation, and the discussion about, again, sustainable growth to think big, think very big. But the problem, sorry, I keep doing it wrong. The problem is, and this is what I don't get tired of saying, that unfortunately, even though we believe in policy, policymakers are all over the place. The framework, how do you say framework in Spanish? El cuadro. I speak pretty good. El cuadro, the lens through which policymakers think has been very much informed by a problematic way to think about policymaking. What is the role of the policymaker in capitalism in terms of both affecting the rate and the direction of growth? And the reason I say we have a problem, I don't know if I'm in your way, if you can see, maybe I should stay on the side, is that this notion that, yes, of course we need policy, but it's just to level the playing field, to create framework conditions. This word framework conditions, of course, in Europe is a very trendy word. Horizontal conditions, to de-risk the private sector, which takes risks, and the policymaker has to de-risk that process. Or especially in economics, we think we're very smart, and we talk about the need to correct different types of failures in the market, right? Fallas de mercado? Ah, amazing. Okay. So, and I think this is a very limited way. All these things, might be useful at different moments, but if this is how you think, you will not transform a city. You will not transform a region. You will not, really allow a country to go from the current rut, difficult situation that it is across Europe, especially in the southern part, into, achieving a different path of growth. And this dogma, the ideology, because it really is ideology, this story, it's storytelling, the narrative, the discourse, the vocabulary that is fed to us constantly, which is just do the basics, fund the education, the motorway, le autostrade, I don't know how you call it, the infrastructure, and then get out of the way so that the cool things can be done by the revolutionaries in the private sector, the entrepreneurs, is a very problematic storytelling. Of course we have entrepreneurs, of course businesses have to be helped, and we need an interesting relationship. But public-private partnerships, which is what we should be building, it's not state versus industry, it's the partnerships. It's really hard to build them properly, dynamically, interestingly, with this kind of vocabulary, that you have the revolutionaries in business, and then the policymaker just has to sort of be there, kind of tread carefully, never pick winners, never crowd out, and especially focus on these very lame, kind of boring ways to describe their own role, which is, we're leveling the playing field, creating these horizontal conditions, and then, yes, we will get out of the way. And so this notion that you're putting bandages, cerotti, we say in Italian, cerotas, no, on these market failures is this narrow framework that I'm trying really hard, and I've just built a new institute at University College London to do this, to really build a new framework through which we can actually think of a different, not just theory, but literally story, discourse, and hence way of interacting between these different actors. So going away from this notion where, the policymaker is kind of boring but needed and all the cool stuff is there, to something which I have called the entrepreneurial state. And I'm embarrassed I haven't put the, Spanish title here, but El Estado Emprendedor, which to me means, why do we call entrepreneurship, why have we used that word just in business? If you think of entrepreneurship in terms of risk-taking, welcoming uncertainty, willing to do, difficult things, as Steve Jobs told the Stanford graduating class, be hungry, be foolish, no? Essere un po' pazzi, we say in Italian. Well, if we look around the world at the places that have achieved smart, innovation-led growth, it actually required some some vision, some willingness to dream, also inside the civil service, inside the state. So get rid of that, again, a problematic narrative where we just think of, one side as being more interesting than the other. And so, part of it, what I've been doing is trying to really also go through the history of the need to actually understand where big innovations have actually come from, so that we get over this problematic way of thinking of the problem where it's just leveling, but actually making some decisions. And also almost all these big revolutionary technological changes in history actually came from particular strategic decisions, consciousness, deliberation within different types of organizations. And the need to actually understand what was going on in those organizations when they were able to think big. But also, instead of just thinking of these big radical changes, each one of these also required, for example, thinking about diffusion in deployment, the use of these innovations throughout the economy. For example, through demand-side policies. What happened over history and what is needed in the future in order to think big, even on the demand side. Carlota Perez, who I know was here recently speaking to you, often explains to us that the mass production revolution would not have had the effect that it did. I'm just noticing these are the wrong slides for some reason. Interesting. Anyway, it doesn't matter. without these bold demand-side policies, for example, around suburbanization. Not that it was through suburbanization that this new type of technology actually affected productivity and change in production, distribution, and consumption across the economy. And she says, today, we should be thinking of green as a new direction, even for the IT revolution, which hasn't really had a big effect yet across the whole economy, fully diffused. So some people make fun of this. Robert Gordon, he puts the indoor toilet here and the internet here, and he says, choose. Which one had a bigger effect, do you think, on families? And I think that's a problematic way to look at it. It's not, do we have big innovations today, or are we in secular stagnation compared to big changes in the past? It's perhaps that we are no longer thinking very radically today about both how to use these technologies, how to transform them, to use them to have transformational change across all of society. So anyway, because I focus quite a bit on the economics of innovation, in order to really hone in on this point about understanding this much broader notion of the role of public policy in innovation than just fixing market failures, I often begin with the innovation chain itself. So if you think of basic research, and don't think just high tech, think of innovation as structural change, transformational change. It has always required basic research, applied research, early stage finance for the companies that even want to innovate, demand side policies, the ones I already mentioned that Carlotta talks about, but even the more classic ones through procurement, and this kind of broad and deep role that different types of public actors, which here are just some acronyms from the US, is very hard to understand if you're really just thinking in terms of putting bandages, So the bandage here in the classic, boring, I think, market failure framework is that the state must fund science. And it's true, the state should fund science. And in countries like Italy, and I think Spain, probably you're not funding enough science. But even if you did, would that be enough? No. You need linkages, you need constant feedback between the science and the more applied processes. And institutions that do that. So the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany, they are very important because they provide this constant feedback between the science and the industry. But the organizations themselves, how the Fraunhofer Institutes were designed is just as important as the actual link. Someone in Germany told me something very interesting, which is that one of the roles of the Fraunhofers is precisely to break down this kind of false cartoon of the boring bureaucrat and the exciting entrepreneur. The same person goes in and out being sort of a civil servant and an entrepreneur. And so this dichotomy, which again is sold to us from magazines like The Economist, is functionally very different there because of this organizational structure. But it's very interesting, by the way, I often put the US story here. These are US organizations, so DARPA, you must know from the internet, because they were very important for the ARPANET invention. ARPA-E, which is the sister organization in the Department of Energy of DARPA, which is in the Department of Defense. But what's interesting is all these organizations today are literally being attacked by the current Trump administration. For the first time in US history, even Reagan increased the spending on innovation. He cut the welfare state, and we on the left, I don't know if we are on the left here, but I personally, seeing myself as a progressive economist, I very much believe in the welfare state, in the institutional innovation we should have inside the welfare state to reform it. But just leaving that to the side for a minute, the innovation funding in the US, interestingly, has actually been stable and supported over time, even in very conservative governments. So it's very interesting to ask, what does this mean today, what is happening inside the Trump administration, for the future competitiveness of the US, when its history actually depended very much on this distributed, decentralized network of different types of public actors along the whole chain of innovation. And it was very much that distributed network, pretty dynamic, not top-down, one ministry. SPRU, where I used to be, my research center, is known for coming up with the word systems of innovation. Chris Freeman, who founded SPRU. And what he meant was precisely this, that you cannot just think that you just pour down a lot of knowledge and research here and think somehow it will just create growth. He compared the Soviet Union and Japan. And the big difference between the Soviet Union and Japan was the Soviet Union was actually spending more in terms of R&D, research, over GDP, but had not formed these systems of innovation, the linkages across that whole chain, and which allowed knowledge to be distributed. Maybe I'll just stop. Do you understand my English, or am I speaking too fast, unclear? No? English is good. I don't continue with very terrible Spanish. Good. Okay, good. So let me move on. So here, sorry, how do you go back? Oh dear. Can I go back? Yeah, so here I put SBIR, yeah, so finance for companies. Because there's a myth in many countries, in Italy for sure, I'm sure in Spain. Do you have the myth of las pequeñas empresas, SMEs? It's bullshit. Most SMEs are not very good, okay? You don't want to hurt them, but it doesn't make much money to throw a lot of money at them. We need to focus on those SMEs that even want to engage with structural transformation, with technological and organizational change. And there's been different studies that have shown, actually across Europe, that that's about 5 to 6% of the SME population. So instead of spraying support, not at all the SMEs, le piccole imprese, we should ask, why are these piccole imprese not productive, not innovative, not creating net job creation? And instead of mythologizing them, really think through different types of support structures that can help the few that are interested and willing to engage with interesting ambitions like your sustainable growth strategy, and provide them real support, enough support which they don't get when you give support to all the SMEs equally. Because by the time it arrives to the few that want to innovate, it's not enough. And so this is an example of a public program in the US done through procurement policy. How do you say procurement policy? Compra pública, where 2.5% of the budget of the different departments, energy, defense, health, have to be spent on SMEs, the small firms, to work with government, whether it's around energy or health challenges, et cetera. And what's interesting is if you compare the private venture capital funds to the, let's just call it, public venture capital funds, this difference remains high. Even in an advanced industrialized country like the US, most of the early stage, really early stage, not middle stage, the seed early stage finance for the few SMEs that are interested in innovating comes from the public sector. In Israel, it comes from Yozma, a public venture capital fund. In the US, there's also InQtel, which is the CIA, scary, public venture capital fund. In Germany, they have the KfW, and they have investment funds within the KfW. Increasingly in Europe, we don't only have the European Investment Bank, we also have the innovation funds, the EIFs, within the bank that are sort of targeting the innovative SMEs. But this is very important. It means innovative companies don't require any kind of finance, but patient, long-term, committed, strategic finance. And historically, and still now, that kind of finance tends to come from different types of public institutions. And venture capital is important, of course, but realistically, it tends to come in later. Yeah, in fact, they have often surfed the wave of this early stage, higher risk, patient capital. But many countries don't have it. In Italy, we don't have it. The Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, our public bank, is basically, I mean, now it's changing. I shouldn't, be too negative. But historically, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti was more about funding infrastructure, subsidizing, actually propping up some industries that maybe really should have been reforming themselves. Anyway, so it's not just about setting up a public bank. It's also about setting up the funds that work interestingly and getting the expertise inside of these funds, inside the civil service. There was a study done comparing SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research, in the UK to the same, in the US, to the same program in the UK, SBRI. They weren't very creative with the name. And the UK one was not very successful. And one of the things they found was that one of the key differences were who was looking at the applications. Now, you get an application from a small company who says, we want to do blah, blah, blah. In the US, it was a scientist looking, saying, no, this makes no sense. Or this one, wow, this is very interesting. No? In the UK, where you have David Cameron, who has told the nation in 2010 that civil servants are the enemies of enterprise. That's actually what he said, and now they have to manage Brexit. In fact, they're not managing Brexit. It's 4 consulting companies managing Brexit, and it costs a ridiculous amount of money. Anyway, when you don't believe in the civil service, when you don't believe in the state, when you keep making fun of it through these cartoon images, it's not surprising that scientists are not interested in working inside the civil service. No? Now, obviously, even in countries where there's this dogma, there's very important, interesting, smart people inside the state apparatus. But there's a self-fulfilling prophecy that the more we pretend it's just about fixing market failures, the harder then it is to make it exciting and attract really interesting and talented people from different parts of the sciences even, who then can do a good job with some of these funds. So they do a bad job, and then the next thing, the fund is closed down or privatized. No? Anyway, so So what's interesting about the iPhone story that I tell in the book is not just, all the smart things in the iPhone were publicly funded, which is the point. All the things that make our smart products smart and not stupid were financed by the taxpayer. But actually, again, this distributed network of different organizations that were responsible for lots of the different sort of parts. So this notion that you have the revolutionaries here, and here the boring, against civil servants leveling is completely false when you look at this graph, no? The revolutionary stuff is inside, completely thinking out of the box for each one of these, often coming from mission-oriented research related to the Cold War, which I'll tell you why that's no longer the case in a minute. But, lots of creativity, talented, big thinking, dreaming occurring in all these different organizations. So, the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, all publicly financed in the same way today that the big new battery storage innovations, related to self-driving cars are also coming out from similar organizations like ARPA-E, came out with the biggest innovation in battery storage. Fracking, which is a problem, we know, at least some people think it's a problem, also came out of some of these organizations initially. And this, by the way, is important because this isn't about good versus bad. It's about transformation. And precisely because public institutions, when they have wanted to, and obviously there's many in Europe as well, decreasingly so, when they have wanted to, the point is they shaped and created markets. They didn't just fix them. And this requires courage, it requires thinking out of the box and better understanding what was happening in the DARPAs or in the ARPA-Es or in Italy during the IND+I phase. IND+I was a very important public enterprise in Italy set up by Mussolini, not a great beginning, and then continued for many years. IND+I in its early phase was public but unpolitical. The political parties did not put their hands in. The second phase was public and super politicized. All the parties put their hands in to distribute, okay, we get this feta. And the third was privatized. The second and third were not very glorious. The first phase of IND+I, public and unpolitical, was its most successful phase, and also the one where the top managers in Italy wanted to work inside the state, inside IND+I. And it's very interesting to compare with the DARPA model, which people have studied, which is similar. So public, but you bring people in for 4 or 5 years through secondment. Some top scientists interested in working inside the civil service told, be crazy, experiment, don't worry about failure. We have this big challenge. Like Italy had a huge challenge after the war. It went from being highly agricultural to industrialize very quickly. Eric Hobsbawm says Italy and China are very similar in terms of the speed of industrialization. And it required lots of thinking and creativity. And we should, once we believe in state capacity, better understand the history of these actual organizations. But it doesn't mean that what they do is necessarily good. It simply means it's transformational. It's shaping and creating markets. And precisely because of that, I believe we should have a bigger debate, actually, about what they're doing. So again, fracking, shale gas, now we question it. People are worried. Why didn't we question it in the beginning, given that it was paid for by taxpayer money? Many people didn't even know it was paid for by taxpayer money because we continue to think, these big changes occur in the market and the state is just there taking away different types of impediments. So part of the story should be waking us up to better understanding and perhaps even having more of a democratic debate even about what's going on there. Luckily, this is not just about defense. It's even about, as I've already said, energy spending, health spending. And in that first graph I had before with the innovation chain, I wrote mission-oriented, precisely because many of these organizations, like the National Institutes of Health, like DARPA, have often quite explicitly, even in their own sort of mission statements, been quite explicitly driven about changing their market landscape. So NIH has been very important actually in financing biotech even before biotech became a real sector. So actually shaped and created the biotechnology industry, and the private venture capital industry came in literally sort of halfway through this wave, l'onda, to surf. The venture capitalists surf this. But what's interesting, again, if you look at the history of this kind of spending, but also in Europe through the Medical Research Council, lots of the revolutionary, new drugs, so new molecular entities with priority rating actually trace their funding to these kinds of pots of money. And in energy, same thing, especially if you look at all the different types of energy investments, renewable energy investments being made across the world, we see a similar pattern that the very high risk, high uncertain, high capital incentive parts of the sector are being financed by different types of public funds up here. And we've seen this literally through a database called Bloomberg New Energy Finance, where the VC guys, the venture capitalists, are preferring to work with some existing technology moving into new markets, but haven't actually been responsible for financing, solar at the beginning of solar or within solar. There's about 5 different kinds, not, if you want, pushing the frontier of solar, but hopping on that wave. And what's interesting about green, unlike IT, is the role of public banks. Right? So public finance, not just R&D agencies, but banks like the KfW in Germany or in Brazil, very important up until the recent political chaos, but BNDES, which is the public bank in Brazil, and the Chinese Development Bank, all having been extreme, and the European Investment Bank being very, very active, especially compared to any of the private financial institutions. And this as well should give us also more reason to even look at, well, which investments are they making? Because finance is not neutral. I should have mentioned before, when I spoke about the SBIR program, comparing it to venture capital, venture capital is very exit-driven. They want to exit in 3 or 5 years, usually through a buyout or an IPO, an initial public offering on the stock market. And we have seen, for example, in the biotech industry, that this particular form of short-term finance versus the long-term finance that I was talking about before has then affected what actually happened inside biotech. So my friend Bill Lazonek talks about PLIPOs, productless IPOs, so little biotech companies being rushed too quickly to issue an IPO, going into the stock market, and then actually not doing much, no product. So if we want the patient finance, we need to better understand how to structure it. But regardless of that, again, don't just think of normative, this is good versus bad. No, if we're gonna have these big pots of money, public money, financing something called, clean tech or climate protection projects, we should also make sure that the portfolios within those public banks retain a wide trajectory, if you want, pathway through which we even define renewable energy. So if all the eggs are in the basket of wind or solar, and then something happens to wind or solar, you're screwed, right? So literally thinking as an entrepreneurial state should make us think as a lead investor how to structure portfolios that retain diversity even within an ambitious area like green. And China Development Bank is very interesting. Many of these companies have since even gone bust, but this is normal. If you are going to be an investor of first resort in any area, not just IT and green, again, and different types of health projects, you will have to fail. And this notion that somehow, we welcome failure. When we talk about entrepreneurs, we say, yes, you need to be more, risk-loving, and the reason Europe is boring and the US is great is because they're too risk-averse here, which, they don't look at the actual structural differences between the countries. If you're gonna have then public investment funds, we also should welcome the failure process, but be more attentive to this issue of how are you actually structuring your portfolio. So even if you are failing on some bits, you're experimenting and exploring across a wide portfolio, but also setting it up in such a way that the public return is not just covering the loss when the failure occurs, but also getting some of the upside win. And when this happens in investment banks, public banks, this is not rocket science to them. This is how they think. What's interesting in the US government is they did not do it through a public bank. So this is not how they thought, and they literally ended up socializing the risks and privatizing the rewards. And this is something I'll get to later, but maybe I'll just mention it now because it's relevant at this point. If you again think of it literally in terms of an investment fund, for each one of these successes, you might have had quite a few failures, but that's the same thing in the example in the US when they financed Tesla. Do people drive Tesla in Spain? No. In Norway, apparently, 30% of Tesla sales are in Norway. But the technology behind Tesla was also very much government financed. Even the car itself, the project, the Tesla S, got public funds, 465 million from the US government. Just a bit more than that went to Cylindra, which was a spectacular failure, which everybody knows. But what was incredible in the US was the marketing, again, the storytelling, the discourse, didn't make people understand that, yes, solar, the Cylindra investment was a failure, but the Tesla investment also came from the public sector. And so they only saw the loss and said, oh, government, you're so stupid. Why are you making these decisions? Why are you picking particular technologies and companies? Why are you not just leveling the playing field? Forgetting, again, that all the technologies in our iPhones were picked, but also that actually this really was a portfolio because the US government was also financing fracking, it was also financing Tesla, and Cylindra happened to be, part of those investments which lost. But they also not only didn't tell the story, they also failed to literally structure it as a portfolio because they picked up the loss of Cylindra, but didn't get any of the benefit, direct at least from Tesla. It was free. It was a guaranteed loan, no? So the loan was paid back, fine, but it wasn't, there was no equity taken out. And the way they thought of it was exactly the opposite of how an investor would think. They said to Tesla, If you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. It's like, if you have all these Goldman Sachs advisors in your government, which Obama did, which is unfortunate, I think that's part of the reason he had problems, at least in that case, they should have told him some sensible investment advice. You don't get the shares in the company if it's a failure, you get the shares in the company if it's a success. So it's extraordinary just what a big step change this actually would have required inside their own mentality. Again, as I said, these organizations, historically, we have a lot to learn from them, not to cut and paste. I would be foolish if I came to Spain and said, copy DARPA. There's no one way to organize these particular different types of institutions, but having a mission, being able to dream a new future, a new landscape, whether it's in health or energy or digital areas, has been absolutely related also to the success of these agencies, as I've already mentioned, to attract top talent. It's exciting. It's an honor to work for ARPA-E when it's really trying to be extremely ambitious around green. If instead the agency was at best organized to introduce a tax credit around green or a carbon tax, all things that are still important, it wouldn't have attracted that kind of dynamism. And if you walk into ARPA-E, before it's cut, it's really actually being destroyed today. It's the first on the list of things that Obama wants to get rid of. If you walk into ARPA-E, it feels like Google. It's a bunch of crazy people with ponytails and shorts and sandals writing on the walls, and it's a very, very interesting dynamic. So there's nothing in the DNA of the public sector that makes it less interesting and less able to think differently. And I organized a conference in 2014 where I invited from around the world, including from Denmark and Norway, different mission-oriented organizations. And by that I mean organizations that within their area were very ambitious, shaping and creating markets, driven by challenges, challenges to, whether it's the grand challenges, whether it's the big, sustainable, smart, inclusive growth challenges, but also mission-oriented, even more specifically, trying to achieve very concrete targets that were broadly defined by some visions set by the country. They have had to, in fact, welcome this explorative and failure process. And the woman who was directing ARPA-E at the time was very explicit to me. She said, we actually measure our success by how willing we have been to take risks. If we don't take risks, we're not fulfilling our duty. There's enough risk averseness in the private sector. If we're there being timid, we're not playing a really smart public role. But, she said, the other part of the equation is we want to make sure that the successes that we have, which we know will not always be there because we have to fail, actually have impact, an important impact, for example, across many sectors. And this is very important because today industrial policy is coming back, especially after the financial crisis in the name of rebalancing economies. But in many countries, this is becoming a boring list of sectors to tackle. Aerospace, automotive, creative sector, financial services, whatever the country is thinking of. And that misses this kind of trick of thinking big around challenges that you might have and really catalyzing innovation and transformation across many sectors. Going to the moon required more than 10 sectors, including changes in textiles, clothing. Now, you couldn't go to the moon in shorts and a t-shirt. And similarly, in Germany today, the energy Wende mission, or in Denmark, this little tiny country, because everyone always says, oh, but you talk about the big countries. Denmark, a tiny little country. Is it smaller than Spain? It's smaller than Spain, for sure. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm not good at geography. I was educated in American high school. Everything was good but the geography. No, just kidding. I did know that Denmark was smaller than Spain. So Denmark is actually today, precisely because it has a mission-oriented green policy, not only leading on the innovation in terms of the manufacturing with companies like Vestas, but they have also become the #1 provider of high-tech services to China's green economy. And China's spending 1.7 trillion, 12 zeros, in green. And it's not by doing things in this patchy way of, here's a tax credit, and here's a bit of science funding, and here's a bit of SME financing. They very much have had a green vision, as Germany has too. And the German energy Wende model is interesting, because again, it's not just about renewable energy. They have forced all their sectors to transform. So steel, in Germany has lowered its material content through reuse, repurpose, and recycle. And it's not just because Germany the steel woke up and said, okay, let's change. It was through this kind of very visionary and mission-oriented policy from above, which then forced, steel and many other sectors to transform themselves. And that's what I think we should be using industrial policy and innovation policy for catalyzing, transformational change across many sectors, not the latest list of your top 4 sectors, which often actually just translates into parasitic relationships where a sector is asking for support instead of being asked to transform itself in order to achieve a societal objective. Let me move on. And I think this is very interesting. If you read Keynes properly, he really said so much more than just the need for counter-cyclical investment. In the bust, there's too much investment. In the boom, there's too much investment. In the bust, too little. We need counter-cyclical. Yes, we need that. But, and in Europe, we didn't have that. There was a much bigger counter-cyclical stimulus in America. But he also said more. He said we have to think big. We shouldn't just tinker on the edges. So the War Projects Administration after World War II in the US, which got artists to come in and to think creatively about how to, again, direct the economy in particular ways, think about using the arts even in terms of stimulating the economy. He also had very interesting insights of what is happening in the business community, because often what happens in business is not just that they are risk averse, but a bit domesticated, no? He says here, they're not lions and wolves and tigers, but there's lots of domesticated animals in the business community. So pussycats and gerbils and hamsters. And this isn't meant as an insult. It's meant to say, ooh, well, we have a problem. As policymakers, we have to get these pussycats to want to roar and become a lion. We shouldn't pretend we have the lion in the cage and just take away the impediments, regulations and tax, and then they will roar. Actually, even what I call creating endogenously the animal spirits is the point. You shouldn't assume animal spirits. You need to create them through these ambitious, mission-oriented policies, thinking big from above, and then enabling from below lots of bottom-up experimentation. In fact, I should have said that before also when I said on the moon. When they went to the moon, 2 interesting stories. 1, lots of sectors were needed, and 2, lots of homework problems. About 500 homework problems got us to the moon, and that's where all the bottom-up stuff happened. Lots of experimentation on different types of public-private partnerships and ways to collaborate. And that's important because it's not about top-down or bottom-up. The grand challenges and the sustainable development goals, which are out there, 17 sustainable development goals, which countries have agreed to, could actually offer us a similar opportunity to sort of think big, but from above. The energy Wende policy is from Merkel. It was very much shaped by the Green movement, which is important. The Green Party and the Green movement in Germany sort of built that consensus in Germany about going green, but then it came down from above. But then what we see in Germany, but also Norway and Denmark, is lots of bottom-up experimentation in different types of partnerships and different types of transformation across many sectors in order to approach that goal. And it's that balance of sort of top-down, mission-oriented directive and then enabling mechanisms from below. By enabling, I don't mean the usual use of the word, but bottom-up explorative capacity in different types of partnerships. And that's possible. Instead, unfortunately, there's still a lot of emphasis on indirect mechanisms through tax credits. These are the blue lines here compared to the gray, which are assuming the lion in the cage. No? You assume there's a lion in the cage, so you just introduce a tax credit. This is a tax credit that goes from government to businesses to spend on innovation. The blue line is the tax credit. The gray line is the direct investment that the government is making, perhaps in the companies that actually want to be innovating. And this over-reliance on the blue in many countries. So not only in some countries is there too little of the whole thing, but often there's an over-reliance on these incentives, which again, sometimes just increase the profits of the company, because you've reduced their tax, but don't translate into investment. And I often say there's no profits problem. And is my time ever going to be up? At some point they said 5 minutes will ring. I feel like I'm boring you guys. Someone will tell me when I need to stop, eh? Good, otherwise we'll be here, it'll be dark. So you told me when I have 5 minutes left, I hear a ding dong or something. So until I hear it, I keep talking. So this assumption that businesses want to do great things then has translated into an over-reliance in tax incentives. We need tax incentives, and they need to be designed properly. We often design them stupidly. But initially what it does is, well, so what do I mean by stupid? If you have an R&D tax credit, you shouldn't focus on the profits generated from the R&D. You should focus on the research that leads to it, yeah? Some tax incentives actually to hire the labor that leads to the research and development. Similarly, the patent box policy, which please tell me you have not adopted. Has Spain adopted it? Very bad. It is the stupidest policy ever. Why? Okay, finally. Okay, 5 minutes, right? Good. So I can't stop now. I have to tell you a lot more things, but in 5 minutes. The patents are already monopolies for 20 years, no? That's usually how long a patent lasts. So as a policymaker, your point is to increase the investments, no? Not to increase profits. As I was saying before, profits actually are record levels around the world. What we don't have is investment. The profit-wage relationship is very high, nationally at least, in many countries. What you should do as a policymaker is focus on the research that leads to the patents, not reduce the tax on the profits that are generated from the patents. All that does is redistribute income. How to get the companies to actually increase their investment in those areas that might lead to the patents is the real goal. And the evidence is that these policies that focus on the profits do not create additionality. They do not make investments happen that would not have happened anyway. They're simply redistributive. So let me move on quicker. This also is interesting if you plot it against countries that are actually spending in the business community on R&D. It tends to be countries which have benefited from these more kind of directed and some mission-oriented policies, which then have gotten the business community excited to want to invest and do invest, and the tax credit might affect the marginal incentive and investment, but it doesn't make them do what they wouldn't have done anyway. And in fact, this is important to put up here in a country like Spain or Italy or Greece or Portugal, which unfortunately we have been called the pigs by Goldman Sachs. But what's interesting in the pigs is not that they were spending too much, a bunch of lazy bastards on the beach while the Germans were doing austerity, but precisely that there weren't enough of these, if you want, mission-oriented investments. There was a parasitic relationship between business and the public sector, lots of subsidies. In Italy, we have a big state, but it's all through subsidies. It's not through investments. You are better, by the way. In solar, at least you were investing. We have huge solar investment, but all through subsidies, almost nothing in terms of actual new manufacturing and innovative capacity. But the way to reframe the whole core and periphery in Europe is to admit what happened in the core. Public banks like the KfW, Fraunhofer Institutes, not only high R&D, but mission-oriented, energy-vent kind of innovation policy, transforming the whole country. Instead, the medicine being forced down Greece's throat even this week, where they're renegotiating, again, this damn bailout, is not these lessons. Not you need to reform and rethink and have a distributive capacity across innovation and build interesting mission-oriented institutions that attract the top people. It's not just about meritocracy, but also how to actually have a less emphasis on subsidies and more on these wide challenges, blah, blah, blah. That's not what we're telling the periphery that they need to do in order to be like Germany. Let me just move on. I'll just finish with this. which is I began with these trendy words, smart, sustainable, inclusive growth. And this whole way of thinking of public sector capacity, the investments that need to be made, the explorative capacity, so you also need to take risks, there will also be some failures, should really fundamentally change also how we think of literally the circular flow in this way. This is just a provocative thing of saying, had some of the profits from the publicly financed internet come back into innovation funds into the state coffers, today perhaps we would have even more money. There is money, by the way, we just pretend there isn't money. When we go to war, they find the money. Anyway, to invest in green. And there's all sorts of different ways to do it, but lots of the problems have been that these sort of problematic ways that we frame innovation, frame our thinking of what drives business investment, has also led to very problematic tax policies, like falls in capital gains tax, like over-reliance in tax incentives, like problematic ways in which we think of redistributive capacity that have actually led to inequality and not stimulated investment. It was actually Warren Buffett, who's not a communist, who, I'm telling you, definitely not a communist, who said, why did you reduce my capital gains tax by 50%? I don't even look at it. I look at opportunities. And so what was interesting, actually, this period in which he's talking about, in which capital gains fell massively, it was a policy lobbied for by the venture capitalists. So these discourses and storytelling around innovation have been used actually to lobby for problematic policies, like the patent box or capital gains tax. Some taxes should be low, but not that one. If you want long-termism, you need to reward, through tax and other ways, long-term investments, not short-term ones. And this whole issue of that, in Europe, around the world actually today, we have too little investment, lots of hoarding. 2 trillion euros in Europe are being hoarded, inert capital, no? But also this increasing role of financialization, so large companies also in Europe, it used to be mainly US companies, using their profits simply to boost their share prices, boost stock options, and hence boost executive pay. This should be seen as a problem for innovation. When you no longer have business itself, because it can't all be done by government. This is, again, about partnerships. Both should be investing, taking risks together, sharing the rewards together. But this is the big elephant in the room, this financialization of business. And I'm sure you have many big companies in Spain. Italy is getting increasingly financialized. So, Fiat. Fiat is not investing its profits in innovation. Interestingly, it was forced to by Obama when they bought Chrysler. Obama said, okay, fine, here's a public company, Chrysler, but you have to invest in hybrid engines in this country, which they weren't doing in Italy. He said, okay. And anyway, this problem to me is an innovation problem. This is not just a financial problem. And in general, this is my last slide, we need to be quite creative in how we think, especially for a city, especially for countries that are still developing, in the developing world, but also in Europe, in the periphery, how to really think through not only the need to invest, but also think quite creatively and how to socialize both risks and rewards. And I'll just finish that by saying this is not just about equity. I mean, obviously with the basic R&D, you just do it and hope for the good that, it spills over. But the equity that I mentioned before, it was for the downstream investments. But also this need for reinvestment of profits. Bell Labs, which was one of the most innovation labs in a private company, came from government at the time forcing AT&T to reinvest its profits into innovation in order to retain its monopoly status. Monopolies are not given by God, they're given by government. So to get a more interesting deal, a symbiotic ecosystem, and not a parasitic ecosystem, we should be rethinking and learning from those. Similarly, from those stories, similarly in terms of patents, the big crisis we have today for anyone interested in innovation is not patents, but what we're patenting. We're patenting upstream. The tools for research are being patented. That is closing down science. In an era where we talk about open innovation, we're actually going back to secrecy like the Middle Ages. That's a lack of negotiation. That's a stupid deal between public and private. So if we're interested in these interesting partnerships between public and private, we not only have to rethink this stupid cartoon image. And I always say Plato said storytellers rule the world. This story, boring story, is justifying a certain type of distribution. But also we should think creatively as an entrepreneurial state, del Estado emprendedor, in terms of why not open up the toolbox in terms of how we socialize both the risks, which need risk-taking, but also the rewards, and get innovation funds to reap some of those rewards to fund the next mission, as opposed to thinking of it as a static snapshot, a one-game deal, which then we say there's no money. That's it.